All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Dan Rothschild, Director of the Center for Civics, Education, and Opportunity at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Welcome to Free the Economy, Dan.
Great to be here with you, Richard.
All right, Dan. I interview a lot of impressive people on this podcast, and a lot of them have very, very interesting careers. And so I know a lot of our younger listeners are they think about their own career and where it might take them, especially when it comes to stuff like this, like economics and politics and public policy, and they like hearing about where people have come from. So, could you give us the quick, as my dad would say, the two-bit tour of where's your career led you to from 20 plus years ago to today?
Sure. So I started at the Mercatus Center about 20 years ago. I was fresh out of graduate school, and someone had given me the advice, figure out where you want to work rather than the job you want to do. And I found out about the Mercatus Center through the Institute for Humane Studies. And I applied for every job that was available at Mercatus, including many that I was not even vaguely qualified for. Talked my way into an interview where I talked my way into a job. I spent 6 years at the Mercatus Center in a variety of different research, communications, and outreach roles. I worked at the left to go to the American Enterprise Institute, where I worked for Arthur Brooks for a couple of years. Went to the R Street Institute, where I started up their state policy program and had intended to stay there for a while before I was asked to come back to Mercatus, where I'd started my career as executive director. And then last year, I let my board know early in the year that as I was coming up on my 10th anniversary, I thought it was probably the right time for me to step down, influenced by Arthur Brooks, who was fond of saying that 10 years is about the right length of time to stay in that kind of executive role. I was able to stick that landing to the day. So I spent exactly 10 years as executive director at Mercatus and then joined the Ronald Reagan Institute in the fall to be the director of the Center for Civics, Education, and Opportunity here.
Yes, and for the tiny number of people listening to us who might not know, the Mercatus Center is a think tank on the University of George Mason University.
Yes, the Mercatus Center is a university-based research center, part of George Mason University, located in Arlington and Fairfax, Virginia. Mercatus is different than a lot of think tanks in that, for instance, one of Mercatus's number one investments is in graduate student. When I was at Mercatus, we supported about 800 graduate students every year, ranging from people earning PhDs in economics at George Mason University, Mercatus faculty, to network through our Adam Smith Fellowship Program, Don Lavoie Fellowship Program, and other extramural programs that brought in either virtually or in person undergraduates and graduate students from around the country to come to Mason and study Masonomics.
That's great. So if you're listening and you want to go to econ grad school, look up the Mercatus Center. So now, your current gig with the Ronald Reagan legacy. So to clarify, there's a whole a sprawling infrastructure of Reaganomic stuff going on. There's the library itself, right? Most modern presidents have presidential library somewhere. So the Reagan Library is in Simi Valley, California, and that I believe is run at least in part by the National Archives. But then there's the Reagan Foundation, and then the Institute here in D.C. And the Institute itself has multiple centers. What's all going on here, Dan?
Sure. So Presidential Foundation and Institute was the sole nonprofit that was started by President Reagan to advance his legacy. And he saw the library, saw the foundation as a place where scholars would come to interpret the past and policymakers would come to debate the future. And part of the policymaker side was having a wing in Washington. So the Ronald Reagan Institute was started as the DC office of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. We've got centers here focused on civics, education, and opportunity, as well as peace through strength and freedom and democracy promotion worldwide. So I've got colleagues who work primarily on foreign defense, national security policy, and then I kind of head up the domestic portfolio within the Ronald Reagan Institute. So my portfolio is civics, education, and opportunity. My colleague Ellen McCoy is the head of our education portfolio, and the opportunity and economic portfolio is really what I handle day to day.
All right. So, this is an interesting question. I think, we can ask ourselves, what does it mean in 2025 to be part of, managing, promoting an organization that's named after someone who left the Oval Office in 1989? Again, for some of our younger listeners, that was a long time ago. Doesn't seem that long ago to me, but uh, does that mean that you kind of ignore transitory politics of the moment and we're just talking about sort of eternal principles, or does it mean you really do need to lead into current controversies to stay current, right? Because Reagan, for example, himself was famous for saying, talking about the 11th commandment, "Thou shalt not speak ill of a fellow Republican," and was a strong partisan in the good sense, I think, in that we expect parties to stand for something. So yes, you should stand up for your principles. Um, but also, he was a former Democrat who famously said that the Democratic Party had left him. He didn't leave the Democrats. So, uh, what does all of that mean to take someone who was a practical politician, right? Even if we think he was a pretty good one, um, and still talk about his legacy today when the day-to-day politics are very different.
So, at the Foundation and Institute, we talk about ourselves as working for President Reagan. And we see that as advancing his legacy, but recognizing that the policy issues that we're going to be facing in 2025 are just dramatically different than they were when he was president. But that said, there are certain underlying values that are timeless that we need to figure out how to implement in a new way. So when we talk about the importance of free markets and economic opportunity, the particular way that we implement those, the policy discussions we have, the discussions around social conditions and culture that are not directly or at least primarily influenced by policy, I think those are still driven by the same set of values President Reagan saw himself as promoting. And I think that those are really fundamental American values in a lot of ways. President Reagan certainly saw those as things that were particularly American, but not uniquely American. So they were values that were really important. They were at the root of what it meant to be Americans, at the root of what our country stood for, and believed that these were universal human values in a way that could be responsibly promoted and shared around the world. So in 2025, America's economic relationship with the world looks very different. Just to take the most obvious thing, we don't have a Cold War anymore, at least not a Cold War in the contours of what we had in the 1980s. We're not fighting a unified evil empire like the Soviet Union. But our economic situation is dramatically different in America. America looks different economically. We're a much richer country than we were 40 years ago. A lot of the nostalgia especially on the right, is incredibly misplaced for a number of reasons, but not the least of which being America is just significantly wealthier today than we were a generation ago. And that's a good thing. So kind of looking down the list of all of the policies that I think matter for economic opportunity: taxes, regulation, education, transportation, housing. All of these have different contours today, but there's a similar set of values and a similar philosophy and way of looking at these things that proved successful 40 to 50 years ago that can continue to prove successful for us.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about trying to compare economic policy debates, say from the 1980s to today, uh, because a lot of the sort of trade and protectionism and industrial policy conversation um, tends to look at the 1980s in a very sort of rose-colored glasses sort of way and say almost as if, oh, if we could only get back to that. But people were talking about industrial decline in the heartland and the Rust Belt in 1980. There was even before the phrase Rust Belt kind of became a sort of go-to phrase. People call it the Rust Bowl, throwback to the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Um, People were talking about the Rust Bowl politics of Western Pennsylvania, the Ohio Valley, and decline in Detroit during the 1980 presidential campaign, right? So like these sort of questions about the economy is changing, the mix of jobs is changing. Some old companies are shutting down. We need to like retrain and reskill workers for a new generation. Like all of those things, all of those same conversations happened in the 1980s.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I remember, as I'm sure you do, when Japan was our number one enemy, and certainly trade and the American relationship was an ongoing source of both strength and friction over the course of the Reagan administration. But most of the Bruce Springsteen songs that we're singing today were written in the 1980s, or at least a lot of them. So a lot of those economic themes continue from 30, 40 years ago. It's not just that there was a neoliberal consensus that came out over the last 25 years. It's not just that we can blame post-Cold War globalization or the World Trade Organization or anything else for the challenges facing America. And this is one of the reasons that I think that Reagan was really successful as a president, and one of the reasons that I think that Reagan is underrated right now, or that Reaganism is underrated right now, is that at no point did he try to gloss over the fact that these were significant challenges and hardships facing America. I think that he recognized that there were limits to what Washington was. And so I see Reagan's populism and the kind of populist way that he addressed these as not the typical way that we think of populism as there's a group of elites that have conspired to take your birthright. Rather, his sense of populism was generally the belief that the American people are robust and smart and hardworking, and they're consistently underestimated by elites. So the Reaganite populism was based in the idea that as long as people had the opportunity to show their mettle, show what they were capable of, that they would outperform elite forecasts, and that was generally true.
Right. So let's get in some of the current day work you all are doing. So I was looking at a very interesting survey, a recent survey about economic issues, polling Americans what they think about big stuff like Social Security and regulation, energy and trade. So first, when it comes to Social Security, so there's, like right now, there's big debate about, entitlements and are we going to change them, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security? Are they going to stick around in the long term? Another thing, by the way, that's been happening since the 1980s is people predicting the imminent decline or elimination of Social Security, right? People say, oh, well, so Social Security won't be around when I'm old enough to retire. People like who are 18 say that today, and people said that in like 1989. But when it comes to preserving Social Security, you asked Americans, look, if we got to make a choice, would you rather raise taxes or cut benefits, right? Pretty classic trade-off. Americans 2 to 1 generally prefer raising taxes to continue benefits at their current level or their current sort of trajectory where they are expected to increase, so much for inflation every year, rather than cutting future benefits to balance the books. And Americans in general are not in favor of tax increases. So like the other thing has to be pretty bad if they say that they would rather have the tax increases. So what is that? That's pretty basic, right? That's lopsided. It's like 2 to 1. It's a little different if you look party by party. But what does that mean for sort of future negotiations in Congress? Is that going to guide it, or are members of Congress so good at evading reality they'll just kind of ignore that?
So a couple of things. The first is I want to be really clear on the question we asked, which was about reducing benefits to future retirees, those retiring in 2035 or in the future. So we tried to frame the question in a way as it's not going to affect current retirees, and it's not going to affect people who are planning to retire in the immediate future. You're right. People generally supported tax increases rather than benefit reductions. And that's pretty much the math of what we can do. We can do one of those things. We can do the other. We can do a combination of both. One thing that I found really interesting was that Americans age 18 to 20, basically 50-50 on the issue. It was older Americans that were in favor of raising taxes. Now, we don't have data on this, so this is purely speculation on my part. But Kent, if you'll give me permission to speculate wildly, I would love to do so. I have a feeling that if we asked a follow-up question, and I would like to do this in our next survey, who should be taxed and how they should be taxed, almost none of those people would be in favor of paying additional payroll taxes themselves. They'd be in favor of funding Social Security through general taxation, through increasing payroll taxes on wealthier people, potentially raising the cap, doing it in any number of ways. So my speculation here is that you are correct, that the American people don't like tax increases when they're on themselves. They think that there is a way to do this in kind of a painless sort of way. And to your point earlier about people having been saying for years that Social Security wouldn't be there for them, if we'd maintained the status quo that existed 50 years ago, that absolutely would have happened by this point.
Right, right.
Congress and President Reagan worked together to create the Greenspan Commission, which came out with a series of recommendations in 1983. Congress enacted most of them into law, stabilized Social Security, kept it solvent for another generation. Uh, there are limits to what blue ribbon commissions can do. And certainly, I think the epistemic and political environment in 2025 is different than it was in 1983. But the only real way that you're going to be able to fix Social Security, make it solvent over the long term, is through some non-trivial changes and getting the kind of bipartisan buy-in that Congress and the president were able to get through the Greenspan Commission. Doesn't strike me as the worst possible way to begin that conversation.
Yeah, there's plenty of situations like that where government, whether it's government spending programs, talent programs, or other things, where people have said, "Oh, well, there's a crisis is coming," and then 20 years later, when there's no crisis, people say like, "Oh, what are you talking about? There was no crisis." They're like, "Well, no, because we made 10 small changes along the way that fixed the crisis a little bit at a time. It just wasn't. You just don't remember one big dramatic thing happening that solved the problem." Um, so answers on regulation are also interesting. Of course, here at CEI, we do a lot about government regulation, and I feel like they mostly track what I would expect from the sort of partisan divide on this issue. So 67% of Republicans say that America is overregulated, and that's hurting prosperity, jobs, and competitiveness. But 76% of Democrats say America needs more regulation, right? Um, so one, I think that's interesting what you just said about, who would, if it comes to, say, changes for saving Social Security, you can ask people, what should we do to save Social Security? And then you could also ask them a follow-up question, how much of that burden do you personally want to bear of the recommended policy you say you're in favor of? I think that's something here as well, where a lot of people would say, well, they kind of assume regulation will either be costless in some sense, or that a big evil corporation will pay for it, or, and then those costs won't actually be parceled out and borne by anyone else. My two-time guest and my distinguished colleague Wayne Cruz has a lot to say about that, about who bears the cost of regulation, as have many Mercatus scholars over the years. So, is the divide between we need less regulation for economic efficiency, or we need more regulation to protect Americans in a bunch of different ways? Is it because there's the difference between those majorities that some people are assuming that we all pay the cost of regulation, and some people assume it's magically costless? And also, there's a kind of new angle here talking about a lot of people are talking about the abundance agenda, and people saying, even if you're a more left-leaning person, you might be in favor of deregulation in certain ways because it makes it easier to do the things that you want to see get done, like build renewable energy or affordable housing or whatever. There seems to be more than I ever remember in the past 25 years in DC, some center-left people saying, well, actually, maybe some strategic deregulation would be better for, quote, abundance reasons. Where do would you want to jump in on any of that?
Yeah, so these are definitely questions that I think need a lot more nuance and polling than we were able to do in the survey this year. You're right. What we saw in terms of people's overall beliefs on regulation generally tracked what we would expect from a partisan perspective, and generally tracked what we would expect from an ideological perspective. But when we ask questions, for instance, on energy abundance, that was also something that tracked in a relatively partisan sort of way, but there was more flexibility among people who were ideologically on the left and people who identify as Democrats than there were when you just ask about regulation overall. Quality of conversation around regulation is changing, not necessarily in a kind of think tank approved sort of way where people are just talking about the size and scope of regulation, the cost of regulation, the incidence of the cost of regulation. All of that is really important. And I think that provided a lot of the necessary underlying intellectual scaffolding and framework for the conversation that's happening right now. We just had the Reagan National Economic Forum last week in Simi Valley, California. It was the first one of these that we did. We pulled together speakers and participants who were Democrats, Republicans, independents, people with no real political affiliation. We had amazing CEOs, founders, members of Congress. Secretary Chris Wright, the Secretary of Energy, spoke. And one of the things that came out of almost all of the panels, all of the discussions in a really nonpartisan way, was that we used to be a country that could just do things, and we are not doing things anymore because of that we have made along the way. And people ranging from Kevin Stitt, the governor of Oklahoma, to Gary Tan, the CEO of Y Combinator, and a major force in San Francisco and Bay Area politics, all pointed out where there were great things that were happening, and more good things can happen if we just had improved the quality of governance and moved government out of the way of things that it didn't need to be doing. And overall, we just resumed an attitude that we were a place that could do things. Like, you can go start a school, you can start a business, you can grow your business, you can put a new deck on your house, you can let your kids wander down the street. We should just be a place that we should be a country of people that do things. There's no reason that we can't do that. We're going to be the best in the world for that. And we've made some policy decisions, and we've adopted some social defaults along the way that are inimical to that. So let's stop doing those things.
All right, I like that idea. So you referenced energy and the idea of there's a question about should we have a policy of energy sufficiency or energy abundance, and it was interesting. There was almost, I think, an exact 50-50 split on that. But the idea that you had the Secretary of Energy at that event, I think, is kind of fascinating because when I was, before we started this conversation, I was sort of thinking back. This was, Reagan's first election in 1980 was like in my childhood. I was sort of, toddler, kindergartner at the time. But I have, read plenty about politics at the time, and I also went on a bit of a nostalgia trip a few years ago, watching old news on YouTube. So, of course, there's a million rabbit holes on YouTube you can go down, and this is one of them. I was watching the 1980 election return broadcast from NBC News in that election night 1980, and then I was looking at some 70s era news. So one of the things that was so dramatic, I thought, about new news broadcasts, national broadcasts from the mid and late 70s, is how heavy the energy crisis laid on it. It was just constant, and not just on the news, on the commercials. All sorts of TV commercials were about how new cars were using less energy, but it was a weirdly non-optimistic view. It was sort of a very kind of like Malthusian trap. Things are bad. When we're muddling through as much as we can, we're really struggling. We are under all these resource constraints, and the idea that there was America's light was dimming, right? The Soviets were rising in Central Asia. We had, it was amazing how those sort of kind of cultural stereotypes about the 70s, Carter era malaise feeling about America were really real. They were just palpable in just the average nightly news broadcast. And that was the stage that Reagan stepped onto in 1980. And I think if you weren't old enough to be an adult back then, seeing some of all of that cultural stuff, the news, the pop culture stuff, gives you a much better idea of why the Reagan Revolution was such a lightning bolt into America, and why you had a huge election success in 1980, but an even bigger success in 1984. Absolute landslide, both in popular and electoral college. So, and it's hard to appreciate from the remove of today, right? So, I wonder what you think about that sort of kind of cultural renewal, as coming through politics, but reflected in kind of the wider culture.
Yeah, so I think we can't underestimate how people like to say, quoting Andrew Breitbart, that politics is downstream of culture. I think that's true to a degree, but culture is also downstream of politics. So I generally see an iterative cycle between those things. Having a president, having political leaders who can articulate a vision of what a better future looks like, and then present tangible policies that move in that right direction, like that's really, I think, an underestimated, an undervalued thing within society. A lot of people remember Reagan's 1984, it's Morning in America ad. What people generally forget is that it started with the line, "It's morning again in America." And then the next 27 and a half seconds were all articulating numbers of how many people were getting mortgages, what interest rates were at, job creation. It was not just 30 seconds of Panglossian optimism. It was talking about how the policies of the first Reagan term had delivered for people in a real and tangible way. So you can't just have the optimism without the policy change, but you can't just have policy change without some vision of what it is that all of this is in service of. And it's something that I would love to see more of in American politics today. I think that, there's a whole discussion to be had about whether that's possible, given our current media environment, the structure of our parties, a whole lot of other things as well. But I think that it's generally something that's worth reclaiming, worth going for. And I think that this is one of the things that's coming out of the abundance movement. I think Chris Wright at the National Economic Forum did a fantastic job talking about this, talking about why we care about energy, not just for its own sake, but as an input into all of the things that make us human, that increase our standard of living, that give us a moral society, that make life worthwhile. So I think being able to talk about even dry things like energy in a context, all of these things really matter for the culture, and they matter for ultimately winning policy fights.
All right, fantastic. Now you had this big event out in California recently. What are we looking at in the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months from you all at the Institute?
So a lot. So we have for the last 11 years, the Reagan Institute and the foundation have held the annual Reagan National Defense Forum. That's the first weekend in December. And that pulls together leading flag officers, folks from industry, civilian leaders, committee leaders from Congress to talk about America's defense posture, defense capabilities, and articulate how do we have a real vision of peace through strength, and how do we execute that in the 21st century. So the Reagan National Economic Forum was based on the success that we've had with the Defense Forum. We events at the Reagan Institute. The Economic Forum will be happening again next year. So this year was truly the inaugural Reagan National Economic Forum. Next year will be the second annual. Have a number of other events coming up as well. But the Center for Civics Education and Opportunity also hosts our annual RISE convening, the Reagan Institute Summit on Education, which is in September. My colleague who I mentioned earlier, Dr. Ellen Dollarhide McCoy, will be leading that for us, and we've already got some exceptional speakers lined up for that. But I think that especially at a time in Washington where we're not getting the degree of vision about what the future can look like from either of our political parties, from journalists, from a lot of other organizations. That's something that we're really well placed to do at the Reagan Institute, and that's why I'm excited to be here. I'm excited about what my colleagues are doing. And I'm excited about the vision for the course of the next year.
All right, sounds great. Well, Dan, thank you so much for being with us. This has been an excellent conversation. And before we go, tell us where all of our listeners should go and find all this great Reagan stuff online.
You can go to reaganfoundation.org. You can click on the Institute button at the top of the page and find out about what's happening at the Reagan Institute. And of course, if you are in Southern California, and you have the opportunity to go visit the Reagan Library, I heartily recommend it. I took my first visit there in 2019, so 6 years before I joined the foundation and institute staff. I'm biased, obviously, but I think that it's one of the best presidential libraries and a great way to spend an afternoon if you're ever out in Simi Valley.
All right. Dan, thanks again for being with us.
It's been a pleasure, Richard. Thanks for having me.